Okay, folks, next example problem I'm going to do for you is finding the inverse of a one-to-one function. If you recall from class, the first step we need to do is to switch the x and the y variables in the equation. Okay, so the x and y variables are now switched, and the next step is to solve for y. The procedure that I'm going to use is I'm going to show you completing the square on y. Your textbook uses the quadratic formula here, so if you want to see a different option, go ahead and take a look at the textbook to see how to use the quadratic formula. So first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides, and that gets my y terms all by themselves. The next thing I'm going to do is factor out a 2 from the right hand side. That's going to give me x minus 5 equals 2 times quantity y squared minus 2y. I'm going to go ahead and divide both sides by 2 to get the y variables all by themselves. I now have x minus 5 over 2 equals y squared minus 2y. Okay, now I'm going to switch colors here to show you what happens when we complete the square. I'm going to take the b term, which is negative 2. I'm going to cut it in half, which is negative 1. And then I'm going to square it. So that gives me a plus 1 here. I also need to add 1 to the other side. My right hand side I can now factor because that's a perfect square trinomial. It factors into y minus 1 quantity squared. And if you don't mind, I'd like to rewrite my left hand side as 2 over 2 plus x minus 5 over 2. By writing 1 as 2 over 2, I have a common denominator, and I can now combine 2 and x minus 5 into x minus 3. At this point, I'm ready to take the square root of both sides. So take the square root of y squared, and then when I take the square root of the left-hand side, I have to include both the positive and negative square root. That's something important to remember. Whenever you extract a square root from something, you have to include both the positive and negative square root. So what I have now is square root of x minus 3 over 2 equals y minus 1. I'm going to go up here for now. I'm going to add 1 to both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus sign. And I'm going to have y equals 1 plus or minus the square root of x minus 3 over 2. But I have to make a choice because this isn't a function. The reason it's not a function is because if I take a certain pick an x value like 10 and I plug it in, I'm going to get two different y's, one for the plus and one for the minus. So I have to pick one of those, plus or minus. And now I'm going to go back to something from the very beginning of the problem, and that's this little domain restriction right here. Remember that a domain restriction of x greater than or equal to 1 turns into a range restriction in my inverse of y has to be greater than or equal to 1. Since y has to be greater than or equal to 1, I need to pick the positive value. So my final answer is y equals 1 plus the square root of x minus 3 over 2. Now some of you might be bothered by the fact that we have a square root in the denominator, and if that really bothers you terribly, go ahead and rationalize that. Second quadratic that I want to find an inverse is y equals 2 times quantity x minus 7 squared plus 5. This one's actually a little easier than the previous one because I don't need to complete the square. I'm just going to go ahead and switch my x and y. And I'm going to go ahead and solve for y directly. I'm not going to expand the quadratic. I'm going to try to get the y minus 7 squared. I'm going to try to get that all by itself on the right hand side of the equation. And I'm going to do that by first subtracting 5 from both sides and then dividing both sides by 2. And now we're at a position where we can take the square root of both sides, and I get the following. At this point I can add 7 to both sides, and I get y equals 7 plus or minus the square root of x minus 5 over 2. But that's not a function, so what do we need to do? Well, don't forget our domain restriction in the original equation turns into a range restriction in our inverse. Y has to be less than or equal to 7. Conveniently, we have this 7 right here, so we only have to decide whether we pick the plus or minus. Since we have to be less than 7, we'll pick the negative sign. And we have our final answer of y equals 7 minus the square root of x minus 5 over 2. And again, if you're bothered by the 2 in the denominator, go ahead and rationalize.